Here is a world where death was not an end, but a performance. A world where empires were built not only on legions and laws, but on the carefully choreographed spectacle of bloodshed. This is the story of how Rome turned killing into an art form, a political tool, and the most terrifying entertainment in human history. Chapter 1. The First Blood. The air in Rome in the year 264 BC was thick with the scent of sacrifice. Not the sweet perfume of incense, but the raw, metallic tang of blood, mingling with damp earth and cattle dung. Beneath the vast, indifferent sky of the Forum Boarium, a makeshift arena had been hastily erected, its wooden barriers a stark intrusion upon the bustling marketplace. 3 pairs of men, their bodies hardened by servitude, stepped into the circle of packed dirt. They were not soldiers marching for the glory of the Republic. They were slaves, their muscles taut with a mixture of terror and resignation. Armed with short swords and crude shields, they were here to die, to honor a dead man. His name was Decimus Junius Brutus Scaeva, a man of noble birth, his face a mask of solemn grief. He had just laid his father to rest, and this brutal ballet was his final duty. Munus. The Romans called it a gift, an obligation owed to the spirit of the departed. This was not yet public entertainment. It was a private, chillingly intimate funeral rite. The clash of bronze on bronze echoed between the stone temples. The grunts of exertion, the sharp intake of breath before a fatal blow, these sounds were an offering. Each drop of blood that soaked into the ground was a libation, a prayer whispered not to the gods, but to the ghosts of the underworld, meant to appease and accompany the soul of a patriarch on his final journey. This custom was not born in Rome. Its roots lay deeper, in the sun-scorched lands of southern Italy, among the Campanians and the Samnites, Rome's former adversaries. There, at the tombs of great warriors, human sacrifice had long been a tradition, but over time, the ritual had evolved. The act of killing became less important than the asterisk struggle itself. As the Christian writer Tertullian would later scathingly observe, it was the spilling of blood for the sake and satisfaction of the dead. But a strange thing was happening. The living were beginning to watch, their eyes wide with a fascination that bordered on reverence. The solemnity of the rite was slowly being pierced by the thrill of the fight. Chapter 2. From Rite to Spectacle. The seed of spectacle, once planted in the soil of private grief, began to sprout under the public sun. By the late 3rd century BC, these duels were migrating from the somber quiet of the necropolis to the roaring heart of the city's festivals. The munus was becoming the ludus. The duty was becoming a game. This was no accident. It was a calculated shift, embraced by a state that understood the power of a captivated audience. The Senate, ever watchful for signs of divine displeasure or opportunities for divine favor, began to sanction these games. During times of crisis, a famine, a plague, a looming war, they would vote to fund ludi, public festivals, in honor of gods like Jupiter. Suddenly, blood was no longer just a private offering. It was a state-sponsored investment in celestial goodwill. The transition was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, like a shadow lengthening in the afternoon. A magistrate, an ambitious aedile, would see the way the crowd leaned forward, their faces rapt, during a funeral duel. He would see the political currency in that gaze. And so, blood became politics. Death became a display of power and ambition. Aspiring politicians began to stage ever more elaborate games, each trying to outdo the last. They were no longer honoring a single dead relative. They were courting the votes of the living with the deaths of the condemned. The cost was trivial, the lives of slaves and prisoners. But the reward was immense: popularity, influence, a path to the consulship. Temporary wooden arenas, once erected for a single day, began to stand for weeks at a time. Their raw pine scent mingled with the stench of sweat and fear. The state's involvement grew, codifying the violence, scheduling it, and funding it from the public treasury. What had begun as a son's duty in a muddy forum was now an instrument of the Roman state. With each crimson stain that blossomed on the sand, a new kind of law was being written. This law was not inscribed on bronze tablets to be stored in the tabularium. It was carved into the collective memory of the people, etched in the stone foundations of the amphitheaters that would soon rise to dominate the skyline. Monuments to a culture that had learned to govern through spectacle. Chapter 3. The Arena's Hunger. An iron gate, heavy with rust and dread, groaned open. A sudden, sharp silence fell over the thousands packed into the stands, a collective breath held in anticipation. Out of the yawning darkness of the arena's tunnel, a lone figure emerged. He was barefoot, his torso bare, his only shield, the desperate courage of a man with no other choice. In his hand, a single short blade felt impossibly small. Across the sun-scorched sand, another gate rattled upwards. A lion, its ribs, a stark cage beneath a coat of matted, dusty fur, blinked in the sudden glare. It had been starved for days, its hunger honed into a weapon. It stepped into the light, not with a roar, but with a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the very stones of the amphitheater. This was not a duel. It was an execution. By the 1st century CE, the Roman arena had become a theater for humanity's most primal fears. The venationes asterisk, or staged hunts, had evolved into something far more sinister. Damnatio ad bestias asterisk, condemnation to the beasts. It was a sentence designed to dissolve the line between punishment and entertainment, to turn justice into a blood-soaked thrill ride for the masses. The condemned were a grim catalog of the empire's unwanted: criminals, captured rebels, prisoners of war, and defiant slaves. They were thrown into the arena against lions from Africa, bears from Caledonia, and leopards from the east. The animals, deliberately weakened by starvation, were primed for a swift, ferocious, and visually spectacular kill, ensuring the crowd got what it paid for. This practice had found its champion in the late Republic. Generals like Pompey the Great, a master of public relations, had staged enormous spectacles featuring exotic animals. He understood that casting men against beasts was a powerful metaphor for Rome's taming of the wild, uncivilized world. Each death in the sand was a reaffirmation of the state's absolute power, a triumph celebrated with thunderous applause. But not all who faced the beasts were condemned criminals. A new class of fighter emerged, the asterisk bestiarii. Some were volunteers, driven by poverty or a thirst for fame, who trained to fight animals for pay. Others were slaves, forced into this deadly profession. Mosaics from the era capture their struggle in stark, frozen moments. A man with a spear braced against a lunging lion, a nimble fighter casting a net, dodging the rake of a panther's claws. These were not fantasies. In the damp soil of Roman Britain, archaeologists unearthed a human pelvis, scarred with deep, gouging bite marks. The punctures perfectly matched the jaw of a large feline. The bones told a silent, thousand-year-old story of a man, likely a gladiator, who had died, locked in a brutal, intimate struggle with a lion, far from the heart of the empire, but still subject to its cruel logic. The philosopher Seneca, writing with disgusted fascination, recounted the desperate measures some prisoners took. He described men who would choke themselves or thrust their heads between the spokes of a moving cart, anything to die by their own hand before being forced to perform their death for a jeering crowd. Their suicide was a final, silent act of rebellion against a system designed to strip them of all agency. What unfolded in the arena was calculated degradation. Hunger was not just a natural state, it was a tool, sharpened and wielded by the show's producers. The beasts were starved not only to guarantee a kill, but to amplify the suspense, to make the crowd lean forward, to make their hearts pound in time with the frantic pulse of the victim. The roar of a lion was not just a sound of nature unleashed, it was the voice of Roman power, a voice fed and starved to serve the state. Chapter 4. Wars on Water. The water shimmered, a vast, placid mirror under the brilliant Roman sun. For a moment, there was an unnatural peace. Then a low, rumbling thunder of drums began to beat, a rhythm of impending war. War horns, their brazen notes sharp and cruel, sliced through the air. And from opposite ends of the man-made lake, two full-sized naval fleets surged toward each other, oars churning the water into a white froth. On the decks of these triremes stood soldiers, their helmets glinting, armed with spears, grappling hooks, and even catapults that launched stones across the water. Below them, watching from stone bleachers that rose in concentric circles, tens of thousands of spectators roared their approval. This was not a real war fought in a distant sea. This was a naumachiae, and it was the most extravagant entertainment on earth. Rome called them mock naval battles, but the blood was real. Julius Caesar, a man who understood spectacle like no other, staged the first recorded one in 46 BC. Near the Tiber River, he ordered an enormous basin to be excavated. He filled it with water and launched Tyrian and Egyptian fleets to reenact a historical battle. The ships were real, the weapons were real, and the men, thousands of condemned prisoners, were devastatingly real. They fought not as actors, but as doomed soldiers in a war with no possibility of victory or survival. The scale of these spectacles grew with the egos of the emperors. Augustus, Caesar's heir, commissioned a colossal basin in 2 BC, so vast it required its own aqueduct, the Aqua Alsietina, just to fill it. On its waters, he unleashed 30 warships, manned by over 3,000 convicts, who clashed in a choreographed storm of splintering wood and dying men. The message was inescapable. Rome's power was so absolute, it could command not just armies, but the very elements. Sometimes, the naumachiae moved beyond the city's custom-built basins. In AD 52, the Emperor Claudius decided to drain the vast Fucine Lake, a monumental engineering project. To commemorate the feat, he staged a naumachiae on its waters before they disappeared. It was here that the fighters, 19,000 of them, drifted past the Imperial viewing box and delivered the words that history would never forget. In a unified, desolate cry, they shouted, Asterisk, Avenue, Imperator, morituri te salutant, Asterisk, Hail, Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. Whether the line was scripted by a clever showrunner or a spontaneous utterance of profound fatalism, it captured the chilling essence of their predicament, men marching to their deaths for the amusement of their master. By the time the Colosseum opened its gates under the Emperor Titus, naumachiae were the gold standard of imperial grandeur, while the Flavian amphitheater itself was likely too small for full-scale naval battles. Some historians believe its arena floor could have been flooded for smaller-scale aquatic carnage. Larger battles continued to be staged in Augustus's nearby basin, becoming part of the inaugural games. Even a century after Caesar, the tradition endured under emperors like Trajan. In AD 109, he constructed the Naumachiae Vaticana, a massive flooded arena near what is now Vatican Hill. There, more battles of orchestrated death played out before ecstatic crowds, proving that the formula for power remained unchanged. Each naumachiae was a microcosm of the empire itself, a demonstration of total control over water, over engineering, and over the lives of men. Chapter 5. When Myths Bleed. At the Colosseum's grand opening in AD 80, the midday sun beat down on the blood-soaked sand. This was the interval, the lull between the morning's beast hunts and the afternoon's gladiator duels. But in Rome, there was no true intermission. This break was for executions, and under emperors like Titus, they had become something new, something grotesquely artistic, mythological tortures brought to life. These were not symbolic reenactments with actors and props. They were real deaths, meticulously staged to mirror the gruesome fates of figures from Greek and Roman legend. The poet Martial, an eyewitness to these inaugural games, recorded the horrors with a chilling, detached wit. He saw a man cast as the mythical poet Orpheus, sent into the arena with his lyre to enchant the beasts. But this was the Colosseum, not a fairy tale. The music played, but a massive bear, unimpressed by the melody, lumbered forward and mauled the performer to death before the cheering crowd. Elsewhere, a condemned criminal was dressed as Daedalus, the inventor who flew on wings of wax and feathers. He was hoisted high into the air and then dropped, to be ripped apart by other beasts waiting below. "How you must wish you had your real feathers now," Martial wrote with biting irony. The performances plumbed the depths of depravity. One of the most disturbing was a reenactment of the myth of Pasiphae, the Cretan queen who was cursed by the gods with a lust for a bull. In the arena, the crowd watched as a condemned woman was strapped inside a wooden cow and thrown to a live bull, a monstrous fusion of punishment, pornography, and mythic horror. Fire was another favored tool of the arena's storytellers. The tunica molesta, a tunic soaked in flammable pitch, was fastened to a victim. Sometimes this was staged as the death of Hercules on his funeral pyre. Other times it was presented as the story of Mucius Scaevola, the Roman hero who thrust his hand into a fire to prove his resolve. But for the screaming victim, the narrative was irrelevant. The Christian writer Tertullian, living under the shadow of this persecution, described it with righteous fury. He wrote of his brethren being tied to posts, mocked as they were burned alive. "We are scorned as kindling men and axle men," he lamented, describing how victims were tied to contraptions and set ablaze, their agony transformed into a public lesson and a perverse form of entertainment. These mythological tortures were never about telling a story. They were about asserting absolute control. By wrapping state-sanctioned murder in the sacred cloak of myth, Rome gave its violence a veneer of legitimacy. It was a message to the masses. The fate of the gods' enemies is the fate of Rome's enemies. The audience received not justice but a twisted, blood-soaked catharsis. And so, as legends were resurrected in fire and flesh, the line between theater and reality, between punishment and entertainment, collapsed entirely. In the Roman arena, myths were no longer simply read or told. They were relived, their ancient horrors made new again, with every scream that was swallowed by applause. Rome's arenas had perfected a terrible alchemy, turning ritual into policy and spectacle into statecraft. As the philosopher Seneca lamented after a day at the games, "I come home more greedy, more ambitious, more self-indulgent, yes, even more cruel and inhuman, because I have been among human beings." His words echo through the centuries, a haunting testament to the dark allure of a world that made a spectacle of death.
And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of love, passion, and life's unexpected turns.